We're going to look at replacing the handbrake in the Mk3 Mondeo in this video. Now, as you can see, this lever is coming up too high and it's not holding the car very well even when it is pulled up to its maximum. And the reason for that in my case is this is an old 2002 car with the early self-adjusting type handbrake. I'll just show it to you here out of the car already. Now you can see at the bottom there's this spring-loaded contraption where the cable goes. This is supposed to self-adjust the tension on the cable so that it doesn't need adjusting, but they were junk and they tended to fail, just like this one has apparently, to the point that Ford dumped the idea, and cars after about 2003 or 4, I think, had conventional manual adjustment levers installed instead. Which is what I'm going to be installing today. This is my replacement handbrake, which I got off eBay. It's the same fit, but as you see, it's missing the self-adjusting mechanism, and the cable at the back has a threaded rod with a simple nut for adjustment of the cable tension. And of course, a threaded rod and a nut is hard to fail. Okay, so you'll need the car rear way up high for this job if you're working on the ground. This isn't high enough, that's better. Here the car's up on axle stands set at their maximum height. I think these go up to something around 400 millimeters. And because you need to get at the handbrake base, which is essentially in the middle of the wheelbase, between the fore and aft wheels, you really do need that height. Now, the underside of the handbrake is above the exhaust middle box, which you can see here, and is shrouded by the heat shield for the exhaust. So to get good access to the exhaust tunnel, the exhaust itself really needs to be lowered away from the car. You can't remove that heat shield in one piece without removing the exhaust, unfortunately. Now the metal is quite flexible and could be cut and bent away, and I've seen that on other cars. But then you'll have no heat shield, and while it's possible to maybe access the handbrake around the middle box, it's still really awkward, and I would recommend doing this properly, which means just dropping the exhaust away. Now I did a separate video on that, just lowering the exhaust, which I'll link to, so I won't elaborate in detail here, but essentially you just need to detach the entire exhaust from all of its hangers and lower it down, letting the flexi pipe at the front bend, and just sort of shunt it over to one side a little, and that will give you access to this space. Now the heat shield is just held in place with these rather primitive nuts, which is stamped out of sheet steel. Now they're in obvious places, you can find them all easily. If they're rusted up well for you, then you might want to give them a soak in penetrating oil, but otherwise just get a spanner on them and they'll turn off. They're quite large, so it was a job for the adjustable for me. You only need to take off the heat shield, by the way, that is above the exhaust middle box. The shields are in sections, so it's not like the entire shielding needs to come down. This one goes around the corner here, which is where one of the handbrake cables runs anyway. So once you have all the nuts off, the entire section will drop away, like so. And now you will be able to see the underside of the handbrake. So these are the two cables which end or terminate at a balance beam, which is attached by a singular cable to the handbrake itself. Now this all works in a fairly obvious manner. When you pull the handbrake, the balance beam divides the force between the two cables, which in turn pull the handbrake levers back on the rear brake calipers, which is what you're seeing here. Now I actually have a seized left caliper, which is why the beam here is being sort of skewed as it's pulled. It's doing its job of distributing the force, if you like. So to remove the handbrake, we will need to disconnect the cables, obviously. And to get enough slack in them to do that, you may need to unhook them from the calipers, or at least one caliper. So I'll show you that quickly. You need to pull out this retaining clip first, and then you unhook the cable as shown, and then it will just pull out and away. Now you may not need to do this, especially if you're in the same situation as me with an old self-adjusting type that's not holding tension, or if you have a manual adjuster that can just be backed off a little bit. The other thing I'll say is I'll have a companion video to this one covering the complete replacement of the handbrake cables themselves, which you may want to do at the same time as the handbrake anyway. So there'll be a link to that below. But in any event, you will need at this point to disconnect the cables from the handbrake balance beam, which when you have enough slack is very easy. You just tug them forward a little and then pull them out. And now we can actually set about removing the handbrake itself. Okay, we're going to shift attention to the interior of the car. Shove the front seats right back on their rails and then have a look at the center console around the handbrake. There are some bolts in the armrest storage compartments. Remove the foam at the bottom to see them, and also the cigarette lighter and the cup holder section will need to come out. You might want to remove the ashtray first and then just get a good grip and pull the entire unit out. And then you need to disconnect the lighter socket plugs and put that away somewhere. Then take off the gear surround. The auto version just pulls away like this. The manual is a little bit more involved, but I don't have one to show you, sorry. You should be able to work it out okay. Next, you need to remove the lower plastic trim on each side of the console. There's a screw at the very front, which you need to undo, and then it's all just clips which disconnect with suitable force. You can leave the trim basically in situ. The only thing we want to get at here are these screws, one on each side, which are holding the console unit in place and need to be undone first. So do the same on the other side, screw at the front, pull the trim away from its clips. Identify that console screw and undo it. Then there's one more screw, and that's the one under the cup holder, which is why we had to take the cup holder unit out. So undo that one. Be really careful, by the way, with this one not to drop it, as I can tell you from experience that dropped screws around the car center console and lower dash are not easy to find and retrieve. Lastly, you need to get a socket on those 3 bolts at the bottom of the armrest cabinet. None of these require a lot of torque to undo, but they're hard to access, so you need a long extension bar, makes life easy. So anyway, get them undone, and at this point the whole console unit should be loose and ready to come out. Final point on this, you need to pull the handbrake up to practically its maximum height to have room here. Otherwise the handbrake handle is essentially going to hold the console down. You won't be able to pull it out. Without the cables attached, it will come right up easily. So do that, and then carefully pull the console away from its bracket at the front, and then it'll be free and you can take it out of the car. Okay, so now you will be able to see the handbrake exposed, and we can get on with taking it out. We need to get back under the car to undo its nuts, which are done up against this triangular black plate. These just require an 8mm socket, so get a ratchet and take them off. You can see here, by the way, why you want to lower the exhaust. So I'm trying to do this above the middle box with the exhaust still in place. Never mind the heat shield, would just be silly. And once the nuts are off, the backing plate will fall away too. And then you can see that the handbrake unit is free now, save for the cable, and also the handbrake electrical switch. This is the little switch that lights up the handbrake light on your dash when the handbrake's applied. So just disconnect that by pulling it off. Then you need to free up the grommet that seals the cable in its hole in the car's floor pan. The rubber might be well stuck in place here, so a blade might need to be worked around it to free it up. Once it was unstuck, so to speak, I actually went under the car again and just pushed it through from the underside. That was actually easier to do than it was to pull from the top. And then once that's out, you can pass through the cable as well. And finally, the whole thing is out. So here's a little overview of the 2 handbrakes, since I have both types to compare. You can see how the manual adjust version on the right has the obviously longer assembly with the adjustment rod, while also lacking the self-adjusting mechanism. I also did some other work on this replacement handbrake before this point. I've spray painted some of the steel work that was rusting, for example. So you might want to do something like that as well. Also check the grease on the ratchet mechanism just while you have the chance before you put it in. Anyway, moving on, let's install the new handbrake. First thing I'll say is with the manual adjuster type, the balance beam won't fit through the cable hole in the car's floor pan. So you need to undo the nut completely and take it all apart. And then the threaded rod and cable will go through and you can position the handbrake in place. You need to push the cable grommet into position in its hole. Again, a blade is useful for that. Just make sure its groove is set around the edges of the hole in the car's steel. And then you can go under the car and put the balance beam back on along with its bits and the adjuster nut. And then the handbrake can be bolted in place. Get the triangular black plate in place and all the nuts on their threads. And by the way, the holes in the car are well oversized for this, which means that the whole unit can move around quite a bit before everything's tight. Which I found a little strange, as it means that if you're not careful, you could end up with the handbrake being at a bit of a weird angle inside the car. So I would say try to keep the bolts as central as possible, and particularly with an eye to keeping the unit lined up straight, if you see what I mean, as you tighten these nuts. I've also used some anti-seize on the threads and the mating surfaces here, mostly as an anti-rust measure and maybe just to protect the paint a little bit. Optional, really. Now, before you get carried away under the car with reattaching cables and so on, get back inside first, reconnect the handbrake electrical switch, and then pull the lever up to its maximum height and get the console back on. And remember, it needs to be up to do this, and if you attach the cables, much less set the adjustment first, you'll wish you hadn't, as when you come to reinstall the console, you'll find that you won't be able to get it back over the handbrake. So at least put the console back in position, and you might as well, do it all properly while you're there. So all of this is obviously just the reverse of removal. Won't go over it in too much detail here. Just clip it in at the front, at the bottom of the dash center console. Make sure the cables for the lighter socket are free and clear, that you can reach them. Make sure they're not, pushed out of the way such that you can't get at them. Test that you're happy with the handbrake travel and that the handbrake is positioned correctly with those floating nuts I covered a minute ago. Get the bolts back in, the ones at the bottom of the armrest cabinet. And then the center screw, which goes under the cup holder. Make sure not to drop the damn thing, because if you do, you'll almost certainly have to pull the console off again to find it. Then the two screws at the front under the gear stick, one on the left, one on the right. Tighten those armrest cabinet bolts, not too much as you're doing them up against plastic. And then don't forget the foam lining, and then you can put back in whatever junk you like to store in there. And then reconnect the lighter socket and the cup holder unit, which of course in turn can then be pushed back into place. Then the console side trim can go back in, just clips at the back and the single screws at the front. Same for the other side. And then finally the gear stick surround goes back on, and that's the interior side of things finished. Right, back under the car. Attach the cables to the balance beam. Now this should be easy. Make sure the handbrake is down, obviously, that you haven't left it up from doing the interior job. As I discussed before, you might need the cables unhooked at the calipers as well, or at this point you might want to pause here and replace the cables themselves. Again, I'll have a separate video on that. In any event, the cables just reattach as shown, and then you would need to reattach them at the calipers, obviously. And then you will have a reassembled but slack handbrake system, so you will now need to tighten up the adjustment nut, for which you need a 16mm open-ended spanner, or a deep socket. A 16mm spark plug socket actually on a ratchet would work here, by the way. But it might not let you get all the way if you need to do the adjustment up a whole lot. I should say about the cables, by the way. Apparently it's the case that the manual adjust handbrake that's now installed here is compatible with both the cables intended for the self-adjusting unit and obviously the manual adjust unit. But the self-adjuster is not compatible with the cables intended for the manual unit. So there's a small difference in length. So if you're upgrading like me, you wouldn't necessarily need to also replace the cables, as they should work. But if you did replace the cables in the future with the manual length ones, you would then expect to have to make a considerable adjustment to the nut. Right, so you want to do this up basically until you start to get some tension in the cables. If you're like me and you don't mind some travel in the handbrake lever, it's enough to set it pretty much on that basis. But what I do suggest, even if you like having a short travel, is that you don't over adjust the nut to the point where the levers on the calipers are ever kept off their stops all the time. You want the caliper levers to go through their full range of motion every time the handbrake's actioned, I would say. And the reason for that is that the damn calipers have a habit of seizing, and my guess is it's better to keep working them through their full range all the time. And by the way, I'll have yet another video on replacing a rear caliper, which is basically a related project because it's the handbrake part of them that tends to fail. At the very least anyway, you need to double and triple check at this point that the calipers are being held and then released properly by the handbrake. That's to say, check that the rear wheels are free when the handbrake is released, both sides, and that they hold when the lever is applied, and then that they release again as expected. Once you're happy with the handbrake adjustment and the cables, to finish up you just need to reinstall that heat shield. Just lifts back into place and then get those nuts back on. By the way, I would suggest some anti-seize on these as they are prone to rusting and seizing. So some anti-seize will make this job easier in the future. Anyway, nuts all back on and tight. Then the exhaust can be lifted back up and reattached to its hangers. Again, I have a separate video on that, so go watch that if you are unsure how to do that job. And finally, you have a working handbrake. Alright, that's it. Hope this was helpful.